Testing, testing. There I am. It sounds like I'm at the bottom of an oil drum. So, anyhow, good morning, everyone. Today we're going to launch into a new journey of discovery as we open the books of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And we dig into all the treasures that are tucked away in those pages. This is going to be a 9-week series over the summer, which will enable us to kind of zoom in really close and dissect some of what Paul was trying to communicate in these letters he wrote to the Christians who lived in Thessalonica. Now, today's message, I kind of struggled with it because it's good. I know it's going to feel a bit more like a graduate studies history lesson, but I want to encourage you to kind of try to stay with me because the information I'm going to give you this morning is going to set the stage for the books of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Sometimes when we open books like this, it's easy to feel a bit lost. It's as though we kind of parachuted into an unfamiliar situation and we don't really understand everything that's going on. Hopefully by the time we're done today, you'll be able to open those books and say, I get what's going on here. So let's begin. Thessalonica was one of the most important cities in the Roman Empire. It's still a thriving city to this day. The Greeks call it Thessaloniki. You see the word Nike in the end there. That actually is a Greek word for victory. Nike shoes are named after this. The locals refer to it simply as Salonika. It's the second largest city in Greece, next to Athens. It's considered the cultural center of everything that's Greek. Over 1 million people live there. But by the year 330, back in the year 330 BC, Thessalonica didn't even exist. It was a conglomerate of 26 little towns near a port town, and the biggest town at the center, the port town, was called Thermae. Thermae is the ancient Greek word for hot springs, and there are hot springs there. Now, you've all heard of Alexander the Great. Okay, this is him here. He's usually depicted as kind of a youthful, godlike figure, but this bust was carved by his personal sculptor, Lysippus, while Alexander was still alive, so this is probably the closest image we have of what he looked like. Marble busts, in our era, we look at these and they all look the same. It's just a head made out of stone. But they were the photographs of the ancient world. There was no other way of accurately recording a person's image. Realistic portrait paintings were still 1,000 years off. They didn't come about until around the year 1400 AD. Now, Alexander was a Macedonian. Macedon sits just north of Achaia. Achaia is the ancient word for, Achaia is the ancient word for Greece. In 336, Alexander's dad, King Philip, died. Alexander became king of Macedon. Now, Alexander was a really interesting figure. His favorite book was Homer's Iliad, and Alexander perceived himself as a reincarnation of Achilles, the hero of the Iliad. In fact, when he conquered the ancient city of Gaza, and yes, we're talking about the same Gaza that Israel is at war with, but when he conquered that city, he had the Persian commander dragged to death behind a horse because he read that Achilles had done that to Hector in Homer's Iliad, and he wanted to be just like Achilles. Later, when he conquered Darius III, the king of Persia, they brought him Darius's most treasured possession. It was a treasure chest, actually, and it was empty. And it was only empty because the chest itself was more valuable than anything that could be put in it. Alexander, however, decided to put the 12 scrolls of his beloved Iliad in that chest. Books hadn't been invented yet, just scrolls, so it took 12 scrolls to make up the book. But from that point on, according to history, the chest never left his side. Now, Alexander was an absolute military genius. It didn't matter if an army had him outnumbered 3-1, he'd find some way of defeating them. Alexander's troops eventually pushed all the way from Macedonia east into India. But Alexander died at a very young age. Historians are still debating on whether he was poisoned by his generals or he died of natural causes. But upon his death, his kingdom, all the way from Macedonia to India, was divided between 4 of his generals, who all aspired to be the next Alexander. This is the lineup here. None of them measured up to his cult-like status. The most influential of those generals, Ptolemy, who I will mention again later, took over Egypt. But another of those generals, in 316 BC, another of those generals, Cassander, the young guy, third from the left there, founded the city of Thessalonica. He named it after his word Thessalonike, or his wife Thessalonike, who was the sister of Alexander the Great. Pretty girl, could use a bit of a nose job, but again, Thessalonike is Greek for victory of Thessaly. So there's that word Nike again in the end of it. Thessaly was a region in ancient Greece. But anyhow, what happened was Cassander took this town of Thermae on the Greek coast, and he built roads out to it from each of these 26 other little towns that surrounded it. Then he gave away free land along those roads. So everybody moved there, and eventually the whole area became blended into one single large city. The Gulf that Thessalonica sits on provided a perfect natural harbor, assuring links for commercial, cultural, military traffic. But starting around the 3rd century BC, the city-state of Rome began to increase its power in the Mediterranean region. And what made Rome so unique, a lot of people don't know this, what gave rise to the Roman Empire? It was their support of innovation. If you went to the Roman authorities and said, I have an idea for such and such, they would pay you while you developed it. Now, if you came up with more than 3 failures, they also killed you, but they invented research and development. And the results were amazing. Now, we don't know the name of a single Roman inventor. And that's because all the new ideas were the intellectual property of the Roman government. But those inventors came up with paved roads, indoor sanitation, street lights, postal services, newspapers, concrete they invented. To this day, we have no idea how the Romans made their concrete. I've mentioned this before. Today's concrete has a lifespan of about 400 years. The Pantheon in Rome has a concrete dome that's been standing for over 2,000 years. And it has a span of 146 feet, and it has no reinforcement. That cannot be done, even with today's modern high-tech concretes. So it remains a puzzle, the ingredients they put into this. But because the Romans gave a blank check to innovation, their empire grew rapidly to absorb virtually all the areas previously ruled by the Macedonians and Greeks. Well, after several battles, conflicts, the Romans were really big at that. In 146 BC, Macedon became a Roman province, with Thessalonica as its capital and the center of Roman administration in the area. Now, the Roman rise to power was not without its struggles, You've all heard of Julius Caesar. Everybody knows this guy. Shakespeare wrote a play about him being assassinated by Brutus. That's a true story. After killing Caesar, Brutus seized the throne of Rome. But he was opposed by 3 Roman statesmen. There was Mark Antony, Lepidus, and a very young Octavian. The struggle, here they are here. The struggle that followed became known as the Roman Civil War. Now, during which these three statesmen here defeated Brutus. They trounced him. Now, in the ancient world, you always had to choose sides. There was no such thing as neutrality. Most of the cities in the Roman Empire either remained neutral, they just stayed out of it, or they backed Brutus, surprisingly. Two cities, Thessalonica and Tarsus, threw their support behind these three guys, Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian. Now, after Brutus was defeated, the Roman Empire got divided among these three statesmen. This is kind of a lousy map. It's the only one I could find. The green was Mark Antony's territory. The pink was Octavian's. And the orange was the piece of North Africa where Carthage was, and they gave that to Lepidus. Egypt was not part of the Roman Empire at that time. Now, Thessalonica came under the jurisdiction of Mark Antony. Okay, and because both Thessalonica and Tarsus had supported him in the Civil War, in the year 42 BC, Antony declared them to be free cities. Civitas liberis is the Roman word. This gave the people of those two cities really special status. Free cities didn't pay taxes to Rome. They didn't pay tribute. They could form their own civic governments and manage their own affairs. And this is the key, they could practice absolute religious freedom. In addition, anyone born in a free city had automatic Roman citizenship. That's why the Apostle Paul could storm around the Roman Empire claiming that he was a Roman citizen because he was born in Tarsus, on the south coast there of what is now modern-day Turkey. Now, I won't go into details about this, but one of those three Roman statesmen, Lepidus was a lousy leader. He was terrible. He eventually faded into obscurity, died of old age. Octavian, in the pink there, absorbed all of the orange. He absorbed Lepidus's previous territory. Mark Antony, the green guy there, that split on either side of Egypt, in his travels back and forth to his territories, met this girl by the name of Cleopatra, and he fell in love with her. And together, they tried to oust Octavian. This is an artist, let me show you an artist rendition of what this is what this couple actually looked like, based on marble busts from the time. Contrary to popular belief, Cleopatra was not Egyptian. She was a descendant of Ptolemy, that Macedonian general who took over Egypt. She didn't have a drop of Egyptian blood in her. Now, Octavian, however, rallied the Roman army against Antony and Cleopatra, and the two of them ended up committing suicide rather than being captured. There's been 9 movies made about the whole sordid affair, and there'll probably be more. Hollywood is fascinated by this story. But after a while, there was nobody left but Octavian. The Roman Senate threw their support behind him, and they gave him a new title, Augustus Caesar. Augustus was the Roman emperor when Jesus Christ was born. But Thessalonica, this is one of the important things, Thessalonica remained a free city, a favored city in the Roman Empire. And because of its status as a free city, where freedom of religion was the norm, it was built into the fabric of society, it attracted a lot of displaced Jews. Now, this is relevant because when the Apostle Paul first visited Thessalonica, probably in around 50 AD, the Jews had just been expelled from Rome. And I'm not talking about a few years before, I'm talking about a few months before. The Roman emperor in 50 AD was a guy by the name of Claudius Caesar. And Claudius was so done with the Jews in Rome that he kicked them all out. He basically exiled them all. And we need to understand that from the perspective of the Romans, Judaism and Christianity were the same religion. They couldn't tell the difference. They were just this cult, this sect. They were all lumped together in the same basket. Luke mentioned this expulsion in Acts chapter 18. And we also find a reference to it in the annals of Emperor Claudius himself. The Roman historian Suetonius described it in his writings. In fact, Suetonius gave a reason for the expulsion. He wrote this. He said, there's a typo there. That's a Hawaiian spelling, 2 eyes. Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. And biblical scholars agree that this spelling of Chrestus is just another way of saying Christos or Christ. This text from outside the Bible is a reference to the conflict that was going on between Jews and Christians and the disturbance it was causing to public order. But when Paul first set foot in Thessalonica, the city was playing host to a large number of Jewish and Christian exiles. The Christians got kicked out of Rome too. These people had just been forcibly driven from their homes. Their synagogues had been taken away from them. Their jobs were gone. Their trade networks had vanished. They had just made an 1,100-kilometer ocean journey to get to the nearest free city. The existing population of Thessalonica was overwhelmed by the influx. The lives of the Jewish populace had been turned upside down, and they and the new immigrants were ticked. Who were they ticked at? Well, according to Suetonius, the Jews of Thessalonica would have been ticked at the Christians, furious. When Paul and Silas left Philippi in northern Greece, or in Macedon at the time, and they made the journey, they walked overland to Thessalonica, they stepped into a hornet's nest. Whenever we read one of Paul's letters, whoever it was addressed to, it's always good to do it kind of with the book of Acts in one hand and the letter in the other. Paul's visit to Thessalonica is described in 9 short verses in Acts, chapter 17. At the time, Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, had just left Paul and his ministry team. I don't know if you're aware, but Luke drifts in and out of the book of Acts several times. You can see it in his use of pronouns. He'll go from talking about them and they to we and us. 3 times he does it. It's fun to read through Acts and try to figure out where Luke is staying behind, where he's reconnecting with Paul's team. But this is the first place. They picked up Luke in Troas. They dropped him off in Philippi. They walked over to Thessalonica without him. When they got there, Paul immediately headed to the Jewish synagogue. Okay, this is an old, early 1900s photo of the ancient synagogue in Thessalonica. Tradition says this is the place where Paul preached. Probably on that, I don't know if you can see inside the building there, that little platform, he probably stood there. There's reasons to accept this as true. First of all, the brickwork is classic Roman. This is Roman Empire brickwork. The arches are made out of concrete. And you may not know this, but the secret of making concrete was lost when the Roman Empire fell, and it was only rediscovered through reading some Roman texts in the early 1400s. But this building no longer stands. It was destroyed by the Nazis during the Holocaust. But for 3 Sabbaths, this is likely where Paul preached the gospel and led people to Christ. He did so to the resident Jews. But when the displaced Jews, the ones who had been kicked out of Rome, caught wind of what he was doing, they pounced. They gathered up some troublemakers in the market, Scripture says, and they started a riot. Because Thessalonica had this official policy of religious freedom, they couldn't play that card against Paul, so instead they accused him of treason, of trying to declare someone, Jesus Christ, someone other than Caesar as king. That was the accusation against them. This is a picture of the Roman marketplace in Thessalonica. This is that kind of passageway in front of those open doors there. It was kind of like a closed-in mall There were gaps in those. That was all domed roof. There's only one piece standing in this picture, but it was kind of an indoor mall, sort of. This is where the riot started, on this strip. Paul and Silas had to beat a hasty retreat. It was just too volatile for them to stick around. The mob went after a man by the name of Jason, who had opened his doors, given Paul and Silas a place to stay. And when the mob couldn't find Paul and Silas, they had Jason and the other believers charged and made them post a bond. Then Paul and Silas headed off to Berea. Okay, let's flash forward to the year 2024. Take a look at where this epistle of Paul's sticks to our present situation. You know, history has witnessed an interesting progression in the Christian faith. At one time, we were not a very popular religion. We can see that in Acts 17 here, when the Jews rose up against this upstart religion and put some pretty serious pressure on the first Christians. And it only got worse from there. When the Emperor Nero took over from his father Claudius, it was open season on anyone who followed Jesus Christ. Christians were seen, they were persecuted for two reasons. First, they were resistant to the idea that all religions are equal and valid. And secondly, they were opposed to the deteriorating morals of Roman society around them. They actually spoke up when they saw moral, problems. Does it sound all familiar? But things changed. It took almost 400 years, but the Christian message began to catch on. At first, the Roman Empire simply ended the overt persecution. In time, they began to view Christians as contributing members of society. Eventually, the message of Jesus Christ gained acceptance, and growing numbers of people came to a knowledge of the truth. The influence of the church expanded, and entire nations became Christian. By the late Middle Ages, the Western world was a Christian world. Now, admittedly, the church, led by imperfect human beings, amassed a pretty sketchy record of handling the things of God. Historically, we've been less than exemplary ambassadors. Consequently, the church began to lose influence. Christianity became non-essential in the Western world. People moved the church from the center of life to the margins of life. Fewer and fewer people attended services. Eventually, the church came to be viewed as irrelevant. To the majority of people living in formerly Christian nations, the desires of their own heart override any desires that God may have. And in recent years, Christianity has taken on an even more negative persona. I've been in places where somebody has asked me what I do for a living, and when I tell them, there's this real uncomfortable silence. And I know what people are thinking. Is he a fundamentalist bigot? Maybe he's a child molester? He must at least be in it for the money. The perceptions of a culture are whatever that culture chooses to foster. Do you know what our culture chooses to foster when it comes to Christianity? Turn on a Hollywood movie. We're corrupt, hypocritical, deceptive, unenlightened. When was the last time you saw a Christian, a church leader painted in a positive light in a Hollywood movie? Welcome to Thessalonica. These letters from Paul are incredibly relevant to our context. In 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Paul answers the question, how do we live in such times, in such a situation? You see, Paul left Thessalonica after being there only 3 weeks. 3 short weeks. That's all the time he had to plant a church. Those who had received Christ during his visit were left with very little support in the midst of severe persecution from both the Roman government and the Jewish population. Paul's purpose in writing this letter was to encourage the Christians who had to live out their faith in a culture that was growing in its antagonism towards them. And it's interesting that one of the most significant features of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians is the way Paul kept pointing the Thessalonians to the return of Jesus Christ, the coming King. In fact, when the printer, and he was a printer, he was a publisher, Robert Estienne, broke the Bible into chapters and verses in 1551. That wasn't a church thing, that was a publisher did that. He divided the 5 chapters of 1 Thessalonians so that each chapter ends with a reference to the coming Christ. He also divided 2 Thessalonians so that each chapter ends with a verse about the grace of God. Really interesting. You know, over the next 8 weeks, 9 including this one, we're going to unpack these 2 letters. See what Paul had to say. You know, in our Western world, things like religious persecution seem a world away. But we need to be aware that it's going on right now. There are places in this world where believers are paying a very high price for their faith. And right here in our wonderfully tolerant and egalitarian Canadian society, polarization is already occurring. Battle lines are being drawn. And while some think that a philosophical shift is maybe long overdue, I think it's worth asking the question, you know, how do we want our faith to be represented? You know, if we're called to be ambassadors from Christ, how does he want us to demonstrate our message to the world? In other words, how do we live in such times? I want to invite you to journey along with us over the summer months as we unravel the answer to that question. And hopefully we can all glean a bit of wisdom from this series. Well, right now we're going to move into what we call our response time, and I'm not exactly sure what you're going to respond to because, like I said, this was more of a history lesson than a sermon. But at least when you open these 2 letters from Paul, you'll know what's going on. You'll know the backstory of why Thessalonica was such a volatile environment for the gospel. Now, our worship team is going to lead us here. Our servers will be standing at the front. When you're ready, come up, receive the bread and cup. We're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper together. When you're ready, take the elements back to your seat. When you're ready, just partake. If you'd like someone to pray with you today, the door's open to the prayer room there. Our prayer team will be in there waiting for you. Do that anytime after celebrating the Lord's Supper. But let's remember the sacrifice of Jesus Christ by joining together as a church community, partaking of these symbols he left us. The bread symbolizing his body broken for us, the cup symbolizing his lifeblood shed as a payment for our sins. Once everyone has shared in communion, members of our hospitality team will receive this morning's offering, and you can also give by at the kiosk in the foyer, or for those of you joining us online, just click on the donate button on the web page. But let's worship God together.